Hi, welcome to USC Roski's Lunch with Creatives. Thank you for taking your lunch hour to join us here today. I'm Haven Lynn Kirk, the Dean of the USC Gail Garner Roski School of Art and Design, and it's so lovely to see everyone here today. I'm so pleased that you're able to join us and that you'll be able to have an opportunity, hopefully, to ask both Ellie and Jennifer some questions at the close of their conversation. So Lunch with Creatives was designed as a conversational creative pause, highlighting unscripted talks around timely topics pertaining to the field of art and design. This year's series was expanded to include hosts from our faculty and their guests from the creative fields that have diverse and unusual careers or trajectories. The conversation are typically held in a much more intimate forum to allow for audience participation, and the talk should spark interest and give perspective to what's happening in our creative community. I'm going to introduce today's host, and I'll let her introduce her guest. It's our very own Jennifer West. Jennifer is a professor of art here at Roski, and she's also currently the undergrad chair of 4D. This is probably the first time in public that I'm saying this. She will soon be our new director for the MFA art program. Woo! So excited to have her join the graduate team. A lot of anticipation there. And 4D is photo, video in our newest area of performance, which she played such a, leading hand in getting this performance art minor launched, which will be upcoming as well. So lots of changes happening at Roski on the undergrad side as well. She's a widely exhibited visual artist, and she's lectured and exhibited far and wide. So I'm so pleased that she's going to be here as our host, and I'll let her introduce Ellie. All right.
Thank you so much, Haven, for inviting me to host this Lunch with Creatives talk, and to Jean Lee for her assistance in coordinating the event, and to our IT team for pulling off our Zoom, and to Kirsten Schmidt for promoting the event. We really appreciate all the work done behind the scenes here. It is my great pleasure to introduce Bulgarian intermedia artist and Roski BA alum, Eli Joteva. In the book by Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, Haraway describes symbiosis as a simple word. It means making with. Nothing makes itself. Nothing is really autopoetic or self-organizing. Symbiosis is a word proper to complex, dynamic, responsive, situated historical systems. It is a word for worlding with, in company. Symbiosis enfolds autopoiesis and generatively unfurls and extends it. I start with this quote by Donna Haraway as a visual and oral dissolve that extends and unfurls us into the work of Eli Joteva. Soil, flowers, salt, light, the human body, virtual reality, cryo sculptures, cryolumens, cameras embedded inside plants, infrared vision, entropy scanning, photographic exposures made from sour cabbage, rainstorms, hand sanitizers, snow, red rice, pine needles, tap water, a body composed of light reacting to each viewer, the spectrum of light on glass, growing laser scanned plants. These are both materials and processes used in Eli's work. Using models and systems derived from research in quantum mechanics, neurophysics, and machine vision, she produces work combining past technologies to imagine future ones. Hers is an investigation of organic and computational memory systems that at the core suggest a regenerative future for beings, both human and beyond. Well, at Roski, Eli was making installations using performance, video projection, sculpture, and photography. She was part of a memorable, strong cohort of students who worked together to make an exhibition in Lyndhurst Gallery where every piece was hanging from the ceiling. Another installation used hanging pieces of tree bark as surfaces for abstract light projections. And finally, she once filled half of Lyndhurst Gallery with soil and dirt, which became a space for communal experience. All of these works have a seed of what she would end up making, developing, researching, and exhibiting across the world since she graduated from Roski in 2012. Joteva holds an MFA from UCLA Design Media Arts program, a BA in Fine Arts from USC Roski. She's also a LACSA grad, I will add that in, an LA County High School for the Arts graduate. And she completed the New Normal postgraduate research program at Strelka Institute for Media Architecture and Design. She has exhibited internationally in venues like Ars Electronica, Fischer Museum, SciArt Initiative, DCIO, Culture Hub LA, xCoax, DA Fest, how do you say it? Sariev Contemporary?
Sariev, yeah.
And Queensland Center for Photography. She has been a resident artist at Vermont Studio Center, ACRE, Photo+Sphere, and an active member of the UCLA Art Sci Center lab since 2016. She is currently an artist in residence at Stream Imaging 3 with Ars Electronica and Fraunhofer MEVIS, and a lecturer at Houdini.school. She is the VR curator at SuperCollideR and co-founder of current.cam. It is my great pleasure to have Eli with us today. And with that, Eli, please take it away.
So touched. Oh my God. Thank you, Jay West. That was beautiful. Such a gorgeous invite or introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here and to share with all of you what I've been up to since USC. My work over the last few years definitely has taken many multidisciplinary approaches, and I definitely have USC to thank for that because the BA program was so interdisciplinary and allowed me to think outside of the box and take different classes. So it influences my work to this day. I still geek out on quantum physics and different types of imaging technologies. So yeah, as an artist working with scientific research and data, I found that my role is to use my imagination to make connections between seemingly unrelated things and find ways to ask the right questions and, most importantly, inspire a sense of awe and wonder in the viewer, which I think is especially important in these times of collective fear that we've been experiencing over the last year. I'm going to start off with a throwback to 10 years ago that Jay was mentioned in the intro. This is my first installation that was at Lyndhurst, and it was made with suspended paper bark tree that I used as projection screens. And I'm super glad that you asked me to find this photo in my archives because it made me realize that my fascination with collecting organic materials, suspending them and projecting onto them really started at USC while I was in your class. Thank you for your inspiring mentorship and influence over these years. But this was also a time when I started thinking about how time is held and distributed through the light of an image. And I projected the same video piece from two ends of this installation, one forwards in time and one backwards in time, because I was thinking about how they could meet in the sort of space-time point in the middle. And then to jump forward 5 years later in my first solo show in grad school, where I continued to explore this idea of the suspended organic form and entropy, but more through the prism of memory and how memory is held within matter, how it's digitally archived, and the kind of connection between these two spaces. So the show was split into 4 sections. Each was centered around remembering either the past, present, or future, and then the space in between. And the kind of star of this show were these 3 cryo sculptures made of organic materials frozen in water. I actually had to buy a really big freezer to make them. They're about 40 centimeters in diameter and pretty heavy. And they function like landscape portraits with natural elements from different ecological sites frozen inside of them. Like the first one is made from wildflowers and sand from the desert. The middle one is from a gardenia bush in the backyard, in my backyard in K-Town. And the right one is from imported Chinese mushrooms. And over the course of these 3 days of the 3-day exhibition, they kind of slowly performed this cycle of unraveling their interior contents and releasing them into the gallery space. Because they were changing so slowly, viewers would often come back multiple times over the day to just see how much they've changed. So now I'm going to show you a short video documentation of it. And the title Nemoawari comes from a mix of the Greek goddess of memory Mnemosyne and the Japanese word mono no aware, which translates to the beauty found in the sadness of a fleeting moment. So the sound is coming from this sculpture where I had a contact mic that would amplify each drop. As a kind of entropy clock, making the viewer hyper aware of time passing by and the materials changing. And scale and the relationship of the objects to the body became a really important way for me to negate a kind of psychosomatic experience for the viewer. There was a very strong sense of smell that came from every sculpture. Each sphere has its own would target the senses in a different way as they would break down. I think at the time I was watching a lot of videos of the ice caps melting and reflecting on my feelings about the ecological crisis and my inability as a single human to really do anything about it. So I considered the containers underneath as these sort of futile human gestures of trying to interfere with ecological cycles. Like on the one hand, working with the desire to contain processes larger than us, while at the same time honoring the power which entropy affords towards evolution. I was thinking a lot about thermodynamics and that the higher the heat, the more chaos, the more possibilities for new combinations and potentials. And then on the digital side, each sculpture was 3D scanned as it came out of the freezer and projected on a large scale in another part of the gallery, which is what you see on the right in this image. This is another pair of the physical object on the right and the scan on the left. And having them side by side in the space really allowed me to amplify the micro material of the present into a kind of planetary scale archive record. And I've been drawn to photography as a tool for preserving the fleeting material reality for a really long time. But this is the first time I worked with photogrammetry, which is the process of creating a 3D model from hundreds of images of an object from all different angles. And ice is actually really hard to scan because it's reflective and reflections end up throwing off the algorithms of the software, but I ended up finding a solution. And finally, it was really important for me to make a real-time connection between the digital model and the fleeting physical object. So I had a VR piece where you could enter inside one of the 3D scanned spheres that was still rotating around you with the audio component feeding in real time and kind of glitching the piece, glitching the image with every drip. So I continued to make these organic sphere-shaped sculptures that would change through time. This is a short time-lapse video of one of them deteriorating over the course of 3 days. It's layered with a partial 3D scan, and it's made with moss, soil, and wood chips. I actually don't think I have time to show you the full video, but it's awesome and you should watch it online. And then later that year, I did a residency in Thailand where I worked with a team of students at the Silpakorn University to build this organic sculpture with a hacked camera inside, whose trigger was controlled by moisture and light sensors. We were kind of trying to ask the question, if the Earth could see, what would it be? So we wanted to make this Earth-controlled camera. And I wove the structure out of local fauna, and it was exhibited at the Mocha Bangkok Museum. In the middle image to the right, you can see the photo that the camera took. And after the show came down, we decided to set it on fire so we can just watch it undergo another entropic cycle of change. Right before the pandemic hit last year, I had the opportunity to make 3 more ice spheres for the Spring Break Art Fair in LA. And I look back on this show with a lot of fondness because it was the last IRL show before the lockdowns happened, with an amazing set of artists from SuperCollider and Fembit. It was a 3-day event in which I showed 0 point field. It's a light piece that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And I made a new sphere each day. The first one was a bit more experimental, and it had this big crash and splash and melt towards the end of the last day, which I actually loved, to sort of bring that chaos and entropy into that space, especially for that fair. The second one is my favorite. It was made of spring blooms, electrical wire, and electronic components. This one evolved quite nicely, I think. And the last one was predominantly made with soil and electrical wire.
Isn't it cool? So everything's inside the ice and it's slowly melting and losing.
I love that little girl. She was really cute. So later in the summer of 2020, I was living in Altadena, which was right next to the Bobcat fire. So it kind of felt like we were living in Mordor for a few weeks. Those of you in LA maybe remember it. And this video was made as a response to that. The sphere is made from coals, ash, and seeds and blooms from Altadena. And the vibrant blue actually comes from a special spirulina that facilitates seed growth. I definitely started doing this time lapse as the fires were burning 10 miles away from me as a sort of ode to the necessity of entropy in larger than human cycles. Yeah, I'm hearing there's some comments in the chat about the sound. It was done by Isabel Beavers, so she was awesome for helping me with that. Later in the year, I took the 3D scan and I simulated it to be on fire. I've been thinking a lot about how our digital artifacts can also undergo entropic transformations. And I also sort of like that in a simulated space, I can make the impossible happen, like set an ice sphere on fire. So I think I might be releasing this as an NFT in the near future, so keep an eye out for it in the digital world. And if you have any questions in the chat, feel free to put them as I move on to the next section. Now I'm super excited to share with you my quarantine project. It's a sort of a sneak peek as it's a work in progress, but it follows a similar impulse of collecting local organic materials, freezing them in water and allowing them to break down. I actually started doing this residency at a residency in North Carolina in 2018, but I further developed it during my quarantine time while I've been in Bulgaria. And for now, it's a print series, and it's basically produced in collaboration with the environment. I'm calling them Cryoloom and storm prints because they are made by exposing photosensitive black and white paper to various weather storms. So I start by collecting and freezing organic materials from my local environment. And then I place them over photosensitive silver gelatin paper and expose them outside for the duration of local storms. This one, for example, was left out for 12 hours in a rainstorm. Then afterwards, I scan and digitally alter them to expose elements and colors that might have not been visible in the physical paper. So they kind of become a digital negative record of a physically eroding process. This one was the first one I made in 2018 with kogon grass, which was one of the most invasive weeds imported from Japan in 2011. And it was all over North Carolina, where I did a 3-week photo residency. I tend to use materials that I have around me at the time. So the process is less logical and more intuitive. This is one made from pine needles from dried Christmas trees after Christmas. And the rocks are placed or there to like hold the ice so I can make good contact with the paper. And there's another one with needles. After the ice melted, I spilled hand sanitizer and left it out for a week in a snowstorm. So I like the idea of setting these parameters for the structures and leaving the rest of the composition to be resolved by the forces of nature. I think it has to do with a bit with me letting go of my human control so I can enter a collaborative exchange with forces that are larger than myself. And sometimes the materials are given to me as gifts. These daisies came from my grandma's garden in the fall, and I froze them for a few months before I exposed them in January. This one's actually going to be part of a benefit show for UCPLA on April 22nd. The forms are also determined by the containers I have on hand. So the circular shape here came from water that I froze in an ashtray, the only container I had available for me while I was on a snowboarding trip for my birthday. So in some ways, they become kind of like autobiographical markings of my time under various storms. And I guess on a formal level, I'm really excited about the potential of digital tools to reveal what is unseen to the naked eye. That through the editing process, these materially frozen physical objects can begin to reveal thermal qualities in a digital space. And we have had a lot of spring snow and spring snowstorms in Sofia, which is super abnormal for this time of year. And it's been really strange to see blooming trees covered in snow, which is what I used for this print. And that led me to kind of start reading about the effects of weather anomalies on the body's hormonal systems. And another fun fact is that since I've been home for quarantine, it allowed me to spend a lot of time with my grandma who lives in the same building as me. And she is an avid believer that geomagnetic storms affect her mood and her sleep cycles. So she gives me updates on the geomagnetic activity every day. And she inspired me to consider the invisible solar storms that our bodies experience being on this planet. So the next step of this print series will be to include real-time solar data, which a viewer can experience in augmented reality. The idea is that the prints will become image trackers for an AR experience that kind of takes over your personal space with visualizations of the invisible planetary scale solar storms. But for now, they're just prints, and I've started to print them on recycled aluminum and metallic paper, so they keep their sheen, and I really like the double exposure that's happening. And they're available on Art Fair and Joteva darkroom.tech. And then I wanted to show you a more performative vein of work, which references the body and its relationship to technology. This is another throwback to USC. This was my final senior project, which was part of a fantastic group show of other suspended works. And this piece actually came to me in a dream. I had the same image of my body being shot in a bulletproof box in the desert, and I was super close to doing it until somebody told me that I would go deaf from the sound impact. So I instead did this collective consciousness survey around vulnerability, and particularly how we share vulnerable spaces over our devices. I distributed this dual question of when/how is vulnerability a source of power or trauma to my community, and I collected the responses anonymously as audio and listened to them on my phone inside of this box for the duration of the opening. Then for my last semester of USC, I studied abroad in Australia, where I finished the series Surrogate Science. I would travel around Australia, placing mirrors in various environmental pockets and holes and jumping to fit my body in these mirror portals. The project resulted in 4 videos documenting the performances, a photo book, and I also exhibited them as light boxes in 2015 at the Vivacom Art Hall in Sofia. And then in the same exhibition in 2015, I presented my first interactive exhibition with sensors underneath. So the prints had infrared sensors, and that would illuminate when a viewer would step up to them and trigger a specific note. It was done in collaboration with Ivan Shopov, who produced the sound, and I produced the images. So the concept was looking at finding parallels between the 7 colors of the spectrum, the 7 notes of the musical octave, and 7 energy centers in the human body. The images were in camera double exposures. There was no Photoshop, and I used a lot of color filters and long exposures through prisms to lay over the exposures of the bodies. Later in 2018, the prisms made a comeback at a photo residency where I got to work in a dark room. I started making these long exposures using glass prisms to bend and paint with light on silver gelatin paper. Later in 2020, I added an AR element that liquefied the surface of the images into a three-dimensional experience that people could see on their devices. And the fascination with the prism and platonic solids really started in 2015 when I was making work for an exhibition, Dark Thoughts and Light Spots, financed by the Sophia Fund for Innovations of Culture. It resulted in this light installation with a video piece that was projected on mirrors and prisms and reflecting onto the opposing wall, as well as a set of self-portraits of my body layered with platonic solid prisms. I was investigating the geometry of thought and questioning how mental formulas impose themselves on the body and how the body can transcend them in an embodied way. Again, some in-camera double exposures. And this double exposure tendency actually started after I graduated USC, when I felt a bit creatively stuck. During the 4 years in school, I kind of learned that art must be conceptually valid to be conceptually like strong and grounded to be valid. And I found this way of thinking left me feeling quite paralyzed and unable to make anything for a while. So I spent some time traveling and double exposing analog films, which I thought of as a kind of experiment in training my intuition. The series took me 3 years to complete, and each film was shot in 2 different countries. This one is in Bulgaria and the US, both which are my home. So I would shoot one roll of film in one country, and then months later I would go to another one and shoot over it. These 2 were in the rainforest in Thailand and an island in Greece. And I was really fascinated by the power of an image to hold 2 spaces and 2 points in time in one frame to create a kind of third impossible space. Here we are in Thailand and Bulgaria. I really liked that the shadows of one location would get filled with the highlights of another. And because I was shooting on film, I couldn't see what I was shooting over, so I had to rely on my intuition. And I was literally thinking about the photon of light as an element that can traverse time on the film's surface and guide me towards finding the best compositions. So out of 100 rolls of film, only about 10 of them made it to the final series, but those final ones were very like aha moments in the time of shooting. I would enter this like very magical flow state of shooting where I believed I was communicating backwards and forwards in time to get the best shot. And then that resulted in an exhibition, a solo show in 2016, where the prints were shown in light boxes. And because it's a traveling project, I made a traveling exhibition box that allows you to immerse yourself in the image anywhere you want. It's comprised of 50 plaques that I laser cut and engraved with symbols of the different countries. And they could be viewed through an old school stereoscope, which I have here, kind of like analog VR. And then in the fall of that year, I started grad school. I chose DMA at UCLA mainly because of the Art Sci Center and Lab Collective, which is an interdisciplinary collective that I have been a part of since then. And I really wanted to work with biofeedback data, partially because I had experienced it in a therapeutic setting, and I found it incredibly effective and fascinating technology for mirroring these invisible internal states and building new neural pathways. So in my first semester, I built a custom software that translated each band of electrical brainwave activity to its corresponding color harmonic frequency. For example, I mapped the delta signals of red because the delta signals to red because they're both low frequencies, or the gamma to blue because they vibrate faster. And in this pixel stream that you see on the bottom left, my brainwaves would generate a different color for the predominant wave at every millisecond. So I recorded my activity, my brainwave activity during different states of mind, which I would then project onto blocks of ice to create brainwave portraits. And for my first crit, I presented a real-time projection mapping of each brainwave band onto telepathic different sections of ice. And I tried this telepathic performance. And on the walls, I had 4 videos of brainwave data recorded during various states where different activities would either simulate larger theta, gamma, alpha, or beta. And then using the same prototype tool, I began making a series of brainwave portraits that reveal internal states. So this is looking at 3 variations of recalling the same dream over the same block of ice. I would record my brainwaves during different activities like petting a cat, watching the election, or kissing someone. And I was also thinking a lot about the material memory of the frozen water. And I wanted to see if the structures would be altered by subtle energies and of the bodies that hold them. So when I started doing portraits for my friends, I would ask them to hold a bottle close to their bodies and maybe even sleep with it before freezing it to see if that would change the structure when I would project their waves onto them. This is another portrait in which I had it for my solo show as an entrance, as a kind of memory of the future. I was thinking about the act of recalling a dream and how dreams can actually be predictive of the future. And I have a lot of them. So around this time, I got introduced to Mayank Mehta, who runs the Neurophysics Lab at UCLA, where they study how memory forms in rats. And this was super fascinating to me because they literally place these rats in VR environments and stick electrodes into their hippocampus to measure how memory forms in their brains. So they have them running around, and they found that gamma and theta waves, the coupling of gamma and theta waves, is actually what's needed for a memory synapse to form. So I found this super interesting, that the sort of high vibrating genius gamma wave, which is experienced in moments of creativity, needs the deep unconscious theta wave that's experienced during deep sleep to synchronize neuron spikes. And working off of that, I built a prototype that isolates only those two bands and could give me a real-time color in real time on top of the band. So orange for theta and purple for gamma when one is more dominant. And then I used this prop as a tool for a series of performances. This was actually like the first time that I was able to take some scientific findings and make a poetic interpretation of them, thinking a lot about how neural light can be used to delineate an emergent memory of the body. So what you're looking at is documentation of me trying to climb a tree that I remember very well in my dad's backyard with my eyes closed while wearing this hacked brainwave band. And it's streaming my activity in real time. So anytime you see yellow, the theta wave is predominant. And anytime you see purple, the gamma wave is predominant. I sort of love this challenge of trying to make an image without using my eyes and kind of tapping into a more deeper embodied memory. And the idea of illuminating a landscape with the body's own internal signals. And this idea of a glowing body, an illuminating body, brought me to Inter-Eye, which was a piece that was actually an ode to the death of a friend who was taken by the Black Sea, which is often called the Sea of Death because it takes so many lives. And actually earlier in that year, I helped pull somebody out of that sea and save their life. So I was really moved by that and thinking a lot about where our essence goes after it leaves the body. And I kind of kept going back to this image of a body that exists between the physical and the ethereal, like a body that's composed of electrons, photons, and waves, all affected by the invisible forces in our environment. So the piece is a rear projected installation of a video that was actually produced by taking video footage that I recorded of the full moon in the Black Sea, and then projecting it onto my own body from 5 different projectors while I perform these series of movements. And it's sort of slow and meditative. I don't know if the video is glitching, but you can also check it out online. So the projection was accompanied by long exposure photo series that was presented in light boxes. Again, it's using the reflection of a full moon light in the Black Sea as a meditation on the transient cycles of life and death and light, life and light. These are the images. I like that they're kind of hard to place. You don't know if they're an interior or an exterior space. There's also color versions of them where I introduced color gels in the shooting process. It was kind of a really dynamic act of making them. The act of making them is sort of an embodied performance. I'm like waving the camera around and pointing it at different reflections in the water. And another long exposure series where again, I'm using my body pretty actively to produce the images with a laser pointer. I was thinking about the durational act of scanning, particularly 3D scanning. Unlike standard photography, which captures an instant of time, 3D scanning uses the shifting position across moments of time to gather structural information about the world. So if standard photography attempts to frame the objective moment, 3D scanning attempts to frame the objective matter. So I found this interesting, and conceptually this project Efflorescence seeks to ask if it's possible that biological life has desires and senses beyond human comprehension. It was inspired by a lot of ideas in quantum mechanics and new materialism. At the time I was reading Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway and Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, which if you haven't checked out, you should, because they're awesome. And I tried through these images to reveal a more fluctuating dimensions of the agency and livelihood of plant life. And then that brings me, all of that research brought me to my thesis project, Diagram Blueprints, and its corresponding light installation, Zero Point Field, which began with a fascination of the invisible ends of the light spectrum, and more specifically, the infrared spectrum that's used in contemporary 3D laser scanners, as well as the ultraviolet spectrum used in one of the oldest photographic methods, the cyanotype. And in some ways, this was an ode to Anna Atkins, who was the first female photographer to publish a book of plant study cyanotypes. She used contact printing to lay the plants flat on chemically treated paper, but I was more interested in using 3D data of the plants to capture and portray them from multiple angles at the same time. So I 3D scanned 5 living plants with an Artec EVA LiDAR scanner and produced these flat compositions from different views, and then printed them as negatives and exposed them to sunlight. So for example, these 2 prints are of a peace lily. I make the negatives by navigating the 3D scans with a virtual camera and rendering high resolution images of different views of them. And then I compose them into the dozens of Photoshop layers to kind of collapse the 3D model into a multiple perspective 2D image. And the cyanotype process is very forgiving. It only requires water to develop. So it was important for me to partially develop the prints so small sections of them still contain the chemistry and remain sensitive to UV light and precipitation. These sections will continue to change over time depending on the environment that they're in, which I love because I think it makes the prints feel more alive. This set of prints is scans of bamboo on the left and then 2 orchids on the right. I also made custom floating frames for them, which was fun. And then I have 3 new ones that I made just last week for a solo show in Slovenia that I have coming up on May 4th at Photon Gallery. And the prints are shown with this corresponding light installation. The scanned plants referenced in the 2D prints are shown in a 3D suspended, rear projected suspended glass disc. There's also a diffraction element placed over the projector lens, which splits the white light into the color spectrum, producing a kind of light echo or colored dirt. The piece is called Zero Point Field, which refers to the phenomenon in quantum mechanics where scientists found that subatomic particle fluctuations can still be measured even below absolute 0 temperatures. So to me, that suggests that on a quantum scale, everything in our world is in a constant fluctuating exchange with everything else. And to show that, I'm using the point cloud scans of these plants moving slowly in and out of each other. And I will be showing an updated version of this piece at Photon Gallery, as well as in Wanzimar Gallery in LA in June. So if you're in LA, come say hi. And this project actually really got me excited about the software Houdini, which I still use today. I use it for this piece and I still use it today. I'm also going to be teaching it at Houdini.school, which launches soon. This is one of my recent render experiments that I minted as an NFT on the eco-friendly Hiketnung site. And they're meant to be different types of memories. I'm also playing around with placing it in AR and being able to experience it in different landscapes. I'm also using Houdini to process some MRI scans of my own body for an art and science residency that I started with Fraunhofer MEVIS at Ars Electronica last year. And in this residency, I was really interested in finding what is not measurable in medical imaging and to locate the limits of perception and how the very act of producing an image shapes our imaginations. But the residency itself was super fascinating. Over the course of a month, I worked really closely with scientists from Fraunhofer to explore the limits of and the boundaries of imaging and 3D modeling and predictive modeling. I also had a chance to do a full body MRI scans at USC Loney. I'm still working on processing the data, but the back end is really fascinating to me. I don't think I have time to get into it, the math, but there's something that was really cool about the, I was drawn to these light colored images, the DTI scans, which is diffusion tensor imaging. It's a kind of indirect measurement of brain fibers. And what I found out during the residency is that those images don't actually map the fibers, they map the movement of hydrogen atoms along the axons. So I'm working with the data in Houdini to bring the molecules that are missing from the data back in with these render tests. So here are some in progress tests. And I'm trying to see if it's possible to get these fibers from other parts of the body, which scientists tend not to do because the body moves. The brain is easy to scan, but the body moves, and the scans take about 10 minutes to do. And I'm also asking the question if it's possible to locate exactly where memory is held in the body through maybe resting state whole body imaging, which is also something that's never been done. So the results are still pending, and the final project will be presented at Ars Electronica this year. And then some final words on collective projects that I've done in the last few years. After grad school, I was a fellow at the postgrad research program, Strelka, the New Normal, where I completed multiple speculative film projects, including Current, which is a film on the future of broadcasting cinema. And it's been shown in multiple festivals and conferences over the last few years. It sits at the intersection of live stream, personalized attention economies, and volumetric cinema, and some AI optimization. But this scene in particular is one of my favorite because we're thinking about endangered sites and how they can be reconstructed volumetrically in the future. And I'm still working on the project today with the current team. We have a couple of different virtual reality reconstructed events happening this year. So I welcome you to check us out at current.cam. We're going to be doing some fun stuff later this year, and you can also explore the VR gallery on the website, which I built. And then speaking of VR galleries, last year I also worked as a co-curator and virtual director for the Phenomenology of Hope show, where we presented one of the first VR exhibitions during the pandemic with over 40 different artists. I co-curated it with Keo Griffith and Kang Nguyen, and directed the production of the VR gallery with a team of incredible interns from Drexel University. It was a huge endeavor, and it took us 3 months to do, but it totally kept us sane during the difficult times last year. And it was really exciting to be able to see people in that space and meet them and talk to them in your avatar self. So you can actually still check out the show at phenomenologyofhope.com. And I think that's it. I'm kind of on time, right? We have time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Ellie, wow, thank you. That was really incredible to kind of hear you're going through so many different kinds of ideas and thoughts and processes, and have done, so much work around a lot of these ideas involving, forms of science, technology, working with kind of bridging machinic, organic, computational, so much in there about the kind of imaging that is used in sort of investigating how you can create images, and really thinking about, say, like the image, what are the alternate kind of recordings of time or representation? Like I was thinking about that a lot. Like, why does a representational image need to be a straight image? In fact, it can be all these other things. And that seems to be, part of what you kind of keep going back to. And I want to make sure that we get to questions. If anyone has questions, if you can either put them into the chat, if you're willing to just turn on your camera and we can see on the screen and ask a question to Ellie. Let's see.
Yeah, say hi.
There's one comment in here. Thank you very much for your presentation. Great work. I also want to note that my parents also believe in geomagnetic activity. I wonder if you can share more about your final year in Australia. In addition, can you recommend a place close near in LA best for installation? I'm not sure what that means, but
best for installation. Yeah, I'm not sure what that means either. Well, my last year in Australia, I traveled a lot after I finished the program. I was really excited to graduate and see. I think we traveled like, I want to say, I can't remember, but it took us like a month of going around half of the country. But before that, I was doing a lot of these performances with my body, which actually you can see on a book online. The project was called Surrogate Signs. And yeah. Are those memory scans hypothetical or proven science? That's a really good question, Clement. I got to say that they were real. I was using real data, but as I was using real data, I realized that the data was really noisy and that there was a lot of interference that would come in. So it's hard to tell whether how valid they were, especially when we're talking about memory formation, because memory formation happens in the hippocampus, and I was getting electrical data from my forehead. So there's so much activity that happens in the forehead that's different than the hippocampus. And to really measure a memory, you would have to stick an electrode into your hippocampus, which I guess they're doing now with Neuralink. So maybe it's possible. The future is here.
Ellie, I was thinking a lot about questions of thinking of image making through the scientific. So this has kind of got me thinking that I've been on a tour of MIT and their labs before. And I was thinking a lot as I was going through and meeting a lot of the scientists that worked in these labs. Many of them were heavily involved in, or not many of them, but a certain amount of them were really invested in making images, right? And so the images weren't this kind of question about the hypothetical or proven. The images were more about being magnificent or interesting to look at, right? And they were less about, so they would actually manipulate images only to make them look more colorful or more sort of something that would awe people. So I thought a lot about this as I was going through, thinking that there's a sort of function of a certain kind of image made also through medicine in your case, you know, kind of thinking about what are the images that are also produced in relationship to the body and kind of monitoring the body. So that, yeah, what do you think about that?
I mean, it's funny, I've talked to so many scientists about the kind of images that they produce, and they really don't put any meaning behind the colors they choose. They just sort of add them because it looks good. And so it's interesting to be in conversation with them to try to bring more a deeper understanding of how colors influence each other, how they could have an effective experience over a viewer, etc. But also on the note of imaging, I found, especially in this last residency, that I was working with a medical imaging center, and there's so many limitations with the ability to image something on their end. You know, they also have, there's also like a border that they can't go past because they're limited by the technology. And I think that that's where being an artist working with that is exciting, because you can start to imagine what happens after that edge, and maybe even ask the right questions that might lead to better discoveries, you know. Because, for example, me asking them to try to do DTI scans of different parts of my body that were not the brain was like a real challenge for them technically, but they were all really excited about, hey, let's try to image this. It's never been done before, etc. Also with the idea of like functional MRI, which tends to map dormant memories in the brain. Nobody's ever done that for a full body. Like, they're not thinking about the whole holistic embodied experience. So it was nice to come as an artist with these sort of like more holistic perceptions and ask them to look outside of their comfort zone, because the scientists tend to be very profiled in what they do. So yeah, it's a fun place to play, I think. It's like using an MRI like a camera is a really nice place to be as an artist, you know.
We have a couple of questions in the chat that I can read. So I'll start with Clemens. Why did you choose DMA? Was it for the tools and ideas or the critique? Did you cross over to the fine arts at UCLA like you did with the sciences?
Yeah, well, I was inspired to apply to DMA actually because of Simran, who I went to school with in undergrad at USC. She was raging about the program, and I decided to apply. It was only a program that I applied for grad school because I thought I wanted to go back to LA. And I was in Bulgaria at the time, but I was also really excited about the potential to collaborate with scientific departments. And I was drawn to the UCLA Art Sci Center and Lab that is based in two parts of the campus, on the north and the south part, the scientific and the artistic. And that kind of bridging seemed really important to me because it's something I've been doing for since USC. So I guess I chose it because of that, the ability to work more interdisciplinarily.
Great, thank you. So I have another comment question. Your work moves so elegantly between images and data, and from one century dedicated to the photographic and our current moment of data. Is there a connection to this in-between state and what you call those things that are beyond the scale of the human?
That's a really good question, Holly. I guess I'm gonna have to think about that. I want to come up with a new word for those things that are beyond the scale of the human.
Because I love that idea of you taking photographs, but not using the visual, you know, not relying on vision. So what's a photograph if it's not relying on vision? I think your approach is like right in between, and it's letting you, because you're using the photographic and you're using data, it lets you kind of get to these questions that aren't answerable with the tools of the past. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I think that's why I'm drawn to new imaging tools all the time and new sensing tools, like thinking about working with ecological or environmental sensors to produce an image that you couldn't possibly see with your own body, etc. And working with biofeedback, also everything that's already embedded in our devices that's giving so much information and can produce images that are unseen to us, but they are producing images. Data can be an image, and it becomes an image if it's filtered and processed the right way. So it's exciting to work with new data as a making process.
So we have another question here. You mentioned in your work your fascination with the unseen. What is the underlying philosophy of that? And what fascinates you about that?
That's such a good question, Deb. I love it. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think it comes from my imagination. I guess when I enter this like really calm state of mind, I see a lot of things, or I imagine things that I think can become real. And so if I rely on that sort of intuitive gravitation towards images that might already exist in the collective unconscious, it's about me being a vessel that taps into that and pulls them out, you know. But I think it's awesome to think about what's unseen and to expand on it, especially within the realms of quantum mechanics, where things are so uncertain, that are very active looking at something might turn it into a solid force. So our imagination and our intention, I think, has a lot to do with making the unseen seen, or we get to choose what it is.
That's awesome.
Are there any last questions or comments?
I have one follow-up to that. Like when you say your imagination, and then you do all these like kind of experiments, your art is very experimental in the sense that like you don't know what you're going to get sometimes, which is like part of the magic, really, for me at least. And that kind of relationship between like what your imagination is and what it actually ends up being, what is there, like, is it always a surprise, or do you feel like there's a merging of those two things where you inject your imagination into the experiment?
I guess there's two ways that I approach working. One is like I'll get haunted by an image that I just can't get out of my head, and I'll find ways to make it happen. And then there's the other way where I'm asking a question and I'm going through the movements, it's kind of like a scientific experiment of producing the movements of getting the answer. And the answer is never something I expected. And the process itself informs what comes of it. So playing in that field is important, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I want to echo this idea of, say, art as an experiment, right? And you really taking that, because I kept thinking with the idea of freezing these organic, you know, when you were working with the orbs over and over again, that you're sort of creating these quasi science, but not science art, you know, kind of merging both the aesthetic and the process. So I was thinking a lot about the idea of preserving through freezing, right? Because right now, human matter, say like semen or stem cells or things that are being frozen for the future, right? So I was thinking a lot about that through your process of freezing. I thought that was really an interesting connection, because that is something that's actually happening, say, in a small scale, with food, right? Like that we use all the time, but also in this other way where things are being frozen in order to preserve them for the future. And you're sort of setting up these kind of mini experiments that mix organic, plants, and technology, right? And have that kind of merging, like the one, like the orb that has where you're trying to get the POV of the earth inside the orb, which is also mimicking the shape, of the earth. And so I was thinking about that too, that these kind of experiments are also a way of looking at something that is imaged through technology. Like the only way, that we understand, okay, the earth looks like this, through the satellite image. And so I was thinking a lot about that, like about the way, and somebody kind of mentioned the merging of these old technologies. So when you go back to the Anna Atkins and using that technology, but then mixing it with the digital, like I always think about that kind of forward thinking. And I went to the Ito Sterl talk the other day, and she was talking a lot about growing plants and vertical gardening through digital processing. So that was really interesting to think about, how do you grow, right? Like how do you grow in this way? And so those were just a lot of things that were kind of floating around my head with these things that you're really naturally kind of drawn to, right? Which is water, melting, fire, plants, earth, and that's why I was saying it's so interesting to look at your student work and then to kind of realize a lot of it was sort of like the initial, seeds were there, but then of course you've just done so much, Ellie. Like it's really incredible. I'm sort of like blown away at how much you've done since you graduated. It's really incredible.
That's my Capricorn obsession going, I think. I think if I don't work, I don't feel good. So I have to keep thinking, I guess. But I love what you're saying about this. And I definitely, as I was making this talk, was thinking a lot about how much the evolution from the organic has started to move into the digital. And now I'm kind of in this in-between space where I'm starting to think like, how can the digital become entropic? How can the digital archive or the volumetric archive change with all the data that we have? And that's something that we explore in Current a lot as a team, because we're thinking about collective archiving of volumetric volatile sites and ecological sites that are disappearing. And what happens if we can collectively archive them, have them as virtual spaces that we can continue to visit, and also in our act of visiting through our attention in the attention economy, how can that feed back into the environments? Because we're spending so much time in these digital worlds, but what if we could choose where our attention was going and how that attention was then generating maybe support for the environments that are volatile?
Yeah, really incredible. Well,
thanks for all your amazing comments, everyone. It's really awesome to hear your thoughts. It makes me feel like I'm not making stuff on my own in my own little world. It feels great to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, and also just a commentary too on the amount of collaborative work you're also doing and these various kinds of, sort of artistic thinking, sort of technological project that you're involved with, like current.cam. I mean, I don't even know, you listed them all up, so I think I'll try to put them.
Yeah, I think collaborating with different people from different disciplines is the way forward. We have to put our minds together from different experiences and to solve the problems we have today. So it's a challenge, but it's really exciting. And I recommend it to anybody willing to experiment, to step out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of end besides a very large thank you to Ellie by putting back this Donna Haraway quote into the chat. And just thinking about your sort of way of working that really embraces the past instead of trying to put it away and acknowledges, the influence of the world at large in this kind of act of unfolding, right? And the idea of making with. So just wanted to end on that note. And thank you so much to everyone for coming. Really appreciate this. It's been such a great way to catch up with you, Ellie, and kind of hear about this very long trajectory that you're on, that doesn't seem to pause at all.
Yeah.
When do you come back to LA?
Hopefully next month. Yes, hopefully next month. I have a show in June, so for everybody in LA, I hope I will see you in real life. I'll send you invites. I have your emails from the RSVPs. And thank you all for coming and showing up and asking such amazing questions and being so present in a conceptual way with the work. It's really inspiring. And Jennifer and Holly, you've both been incredible inspirations to me since USC, and I think very fondly of you. And I'm so happy that we got to work together and that you're my mentors and that we continue to have these conversations into the future. I hope they continue.
Absolutely. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Take care, everyone. Bye.